In my last episode, I summarized our situation. I'd quit my job, and we'd given up our rented mobile home in Wisconsin. Our 1968 VW bus became our mobile home in the truest sense of the word, as we officially launched our missionary journey from my parents' house in Colorado on January 14th. 11 months later, on December 17th, we arrived back at our starting point, having traveled 24,000 miles, and during which time I had preached in 14 states and one Canadian province. And I had taken a 10-week linguistics course in Seattle. I thought it was going to be easy to narrate our experiences. I kept detailed journals from the early years, from 1971 to 1981 at least, so there's no problem with sequences of events or a lack of material to draw from. But it's been nearly 8 months since my last post on this podcast. What's the problem? For one thing, reading a journal written over 50 years ago is hard work. On nearly every page, I encounter references to events and people I had completely forgotten about, or others I happen to remember and would rather forget. And how do I extract the nuggets of useful lessons from the dross of drudgery of everyday life and produce a story that's more than just entertaining? It would be so easy to slide down the slippery slope of sentimentality and wax long on the good old days and recall dear ones who are no longer with us. I realize that those good old days were not always so good after all, and that helps keep sentimentality in check. But it would be worse to go the route of exaggeration just to sell the story. Here's my stab at being instructive and not merely informative. I want this to be a realistic narrative, not a reactionary diatribe against offenses, perceived or real, on the one hand, or romanticized cover-up of the actual difficulties we had to deal with. Many a missionary family has shipwrecked on the rocks of disillusionment when they discover that life on the foreign mission field is not the glamorous adventure they had created in their minds. I'm starting with a cast of characters, a brief presentation of the key players in the story, some of whom were flesh and blood people, while others are inanimate objects or abstract spiritual and emotional challenges and situations that we dealt with. First of all, our family in 1971. Me, Ed, I was 24, accompanied by Abby, 23, Rachel, 3, and Rick, 2. When I mention our ages, the brief thought flashes through my mind. What in the world were we thinking? The fifth member of our family was our 1968 VW bus. It was aged 3.5 years and 74,000 miles at the end of the year. I do see Volkswagen is planning to revive the Combi, an EV model, I believe. And if the only consideration were sentimentality, I'd be first in line to buy one. Don't worry, not happening. It was literally our home for the entire year. See the following episode, part 2, for more on that. It was part of the family. It ate even when we didn't, and saw its doctors more often than we consulted ours. As for demanding our attention, it was worse than the kids. At various times during the trip, I had to reset the points. Who does that anymore? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I won't bother to explain it here. Google it. Just know that if the points were worn out or not set right, the engine wouldn't run smoothly or wouldn't run at all. One time I had to pull off to the side of the road and reset the points just so we could get across the mountains in Washington on the way to Tacoma. In July there was an oil leak and the engine had to be pulled twice in 1 month. Then there were shock absorbers and later brake shoes that had to be replaced, not to mention flats and worn tires. By the time we got back to Colorado in December, the transmission wouldn't stay in fourth gear and needed major work. For the engine rebuild and transmission work, there were men in the churches who offered the labor. We just had to come up with the parts. So not only did we have to deal with Rachel's and Rick's bouts of fever and infection on a couple of occasions, or Abby's urgent need for dental work, the VW's health was a constant concern and a strain on our finances. Family. You put up a lot with them. Then there was Abby's piano. Although her piano only appeared briefly in this part of our story, over the years it had a key role, no pun, folks, which was played by different pianos. No pun again. Be advised, you will hear about her piano several times throughout the course of these 45 years. Then there's Brother Gene Garner, pastor of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church of Rockford, Illinois. This was the church where we were members. We were not affiliated with any mission board or sending agency, and when we heard the call of God to go to Brazil, we asked this church to send us out, modeled after the example of Paul and Barnabas being sent on their first missionary journey by the church at Antioch in Acts 13. The church and pastor helped us with the paperwork for our visas through the Brazilian consulate in Chicago, but they were a small church, and so was the financial support. My records show it was less than $100 for the year. More about our financial situation in part 3 of this podcast. Brother Garner and the church in Rockford appear mainly in the years 1971 and 72 and the early years in Brazil. Other players, veteran missionaries, Brother Steve Montgomery, whose funeral we attended in the summer of 2022. See episode 3, Thoughts on the Passing of a Generation. And there was Brother Don Ross. We met them when they came by our church in Colorado when I was a teenager, and they were God's instruments for putting the mission field in Brazil on our hearts. By the time we arrived on the field, these men and their families had been there almost 20 years. Brother Ross worked in the suburbs of São Paulo, and he did his best to convince me to work with him in a school for training preachers. Brother Steve began his mission work in Brazil, in São Paulo, but then moved to the interior of São Paulo state, where he organized several churches in small towns. I felt called to do church planting, and accordingly we ended up living next door to the Montgomerys in the interior of São Paulo state, 250 miles west of the capital city. These two missionaries were responsible for giving us contacts with many of the churches we visited. Another key player in this story is Brother Edward Bird, otherwise known as Dad to Abby. In other words, he was my father-in-law. But I found it hard to call him anything except Brother Bird, even though in private correspondence towards the end of his life, I did address him as Dad. When I was 9, he was my pastor in Colorado and baptized me. He and the family moved on shortly after that, and it was only 7 years later that our paths crossed again. This time I was much more interested in his 15-year-old daughter than I was when I was 9. Truth be told, I was also much more interested in her than I was in him. I mention him here, however, primarily not because of the family connection. His role in our missionary experiences went far beyond family ties, as will become clear as the years pass. He taught New Testament Greek at the Missionary Baptist Seminary in Little Rock in the late 1940s. This was an arm of the American Baptist Association. Sometime in the early 50s, he fell into disfavor with the leadership of the ABA and the school, and he was forced to leave the school and spent most, for the rest of his life, pastoring small independent missionary Baptist churches in Colorado, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Texas, as well as in Arkansas, of course. He spent a few years or so at each place, several times leaving one state to work in another, then later returning and pastoring another church in the area where he had pastored earlier. Abby went to 10 different schools in 5 different states before she graduated from high school. The next key element is the reminder. It's an 8-page letter-sized paper, self-published monthly by Brother Bird for 40 years or more. In the early years, the paper was mimeographed, but he eventually bought an offset printer and burned the metal plates himself, which he used in printing the paper. The content of the paper consisted mainly of his commentary on Bible passages and his interpretation of doctrinal issues. He mailed around 600 copies a month all over the U.S., and this, more than any other medium, was the tie that connected the churches we visited, and it played a major role in the later events surrounding our work abroad. In the end, it was the doctrinal positions taken by my father-in-law in the Reminder that overshadowed all our relationships with churches wherever we went. I was first and foremost Brother Bird's son-in-law, for good or bad. It was a situation that took almost 30 years to come to full fruition. Foreshadowing the future, I find in reading my journal for 1971 that there were seeds that were being sown or had begun to sprout in the first 12 months of our mission work. Some of those seeds lay dormant, and it was only years later they burst forth in full bloom. Others were constant, ongoing factors that we accepted as a natural part of our walk with God. Some people might describe them as sacrifices, although I can't think of anything we really thought of as being a sacrifice. We were just obeying God. I see three main areas where events foreshadowed what the future would hold for us. They deal with our home and family relationships. They deal with our financial issues. And then there are the doctrinal questions. Each of these is more fully explained in the next 3 episodes.